There are two versions of how Davy Crockett died. One is the story America needed. The other is the story a Mexican officer wrote down while the blood was still drying. Both have witnesses. Both cannot be true. And then there is the boy, the one who was lying on a stone floor while the killing happened on the other side of the door. San Antonio, Texas. The year is 1877. An old man sits across from a journalist in a dim room. His name is Enrique Esparza. He is in his 50s now, but the journalist has come to ask him about a single morning when he was a boy no older than 14, the morning his father died. The morning the most famous frontiersman in America may have been dragged before a Mexican general and executed on the spot. Enrique has not talked about it in decades, but today he speaks. Rewind 41 years. It is not yet 6 in the morning on March 6, 1836. The air outside the Alamo is cool and still. Inside the chapel, a boy lies on the stone floor beside his mother and siblings. His father, Gregorio, is somewhere out in the courtyard behind one of the cannons. The boy does not know it yet, but in the next 90 minutes, nearly every man in this compound will be dead. His father will be one of them. In approximately 90 minutes, less time than it takes to watch a single movie, somewhere between 600 and 800 men will be killed or wounded inside 3 acres of dust and stone. How did Davy Crockett actually die? The version most Americans know has him swinging his rifle like a club, surrounded by Mexican bayonets, going down fighting. But a Mexican officer's diary, hidden for over a century, tells a completely different story, one of capture and execution at dawn. By the end of this video, you will know what happened inside those walls, and you will understand why the truth might be more disturbing than either version of the legend. David Crockett was 49 years old and a man with nothing left to lose. A year earlier, he had been a United States congressman, a backwoods celebrity famous enough to inspire stage plays and dime novels while he was still alive. Then he crossed Andrew Jackson on the Indian Removal Act, and the voters of Tennessee threw him out. The man who had hunted bears and charmed the halls of Washington was suddenly a has-been, broke, humiliated, looking for a new life. So he went to Texas, not as a soldier, not under orders, as a private citizen with a long rifle and a small group of Tennessee volunteers. Before he left, he reportedly told his former constituents one of the most famous farewell lines in American history: "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." He arrived at the Alamo in early February. He was not a Texan citizen. He held no rank. He joined the garrison as a volunteer. A famous man who was on paper nobody. In a letter to his family, he wrote that he would rather be in his present situation than be elected to a seat in Congress for life. There is something in that sentence, defiance, relief, maybe even joy, that tells you more about where Crockett's head was than any biography ever could. The man nominally in charge of the garrison was William Barrett Travis, 26 years old, a lawyer from Alabama who had left behind a wife, children, and a mountain of debt to come to Texas looking for a second chance. He had found instead command of a crumbling old Spanish mission with too few men and too many walls to defend. He had never commanded anything like this. He was learning as he went, and marching toward them both was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, 42 years old, a professional soldier since his teens, who called himself the Napoleon of the West. He had brought an army of 6,000 men from central Mexico, many of them conscripts. Young men from the towns and villages of Puebla and Guanajuato and Veracruz marched hundreds of miles north through winter cold on roads that barely existed, eating rations of corn and dried meat, their uniforms worn thin. Santa Anna called himself their savior. His soldiers called him something else when the officers were not listening. He was a gambler who confused spectacle with strategy and ego with destiny. The celebrity with no country, the young lawyer with no army, and the general with no mercy were converging on 3 acres of crumbling stone. What happened next would kill almost all of them and create a myth that America still has not untangled. The Alamo was never meant to be a fortress. It was an old Spanish mission, its thick stone walls enclosing roughly 3 acres. The walls stood 8 to 12 feet high in most places, but there were weak spots. A low stretch along the north side where demolition or neglect had left the stone crumbling, and a wooden palisade on the south side, just logs and dirt connecting the chapel to the long barracks. It was the weakest point in the entire compound, a stretch of improvised wall that would not have stopped a determined man with a running start. This was where Crockett and his Tennessee volunteers were assigned. Inside this compound were roughly 189 men. They had 18 cannons of various calibers positioned on platforms at the corners and along the walls. They had long rifles, Kentucky and Tennessee models, capable of accurate fire at ranges the Mexican smoothbore muskets could not match. And they had nowhere to go. James Bowie was supposed to share command with Travis. He was around 40, a knife fighter from the Louisiana frontier whose wife and children had been killed by cholera. By late February, none of it mattered. Bowie was bedridden with typhoid, or pneumonia, or tuberculosis. Too sick to stand, let alone lead. Think about the math for a moment. 189 men spread across 3 acres. That is roughly 1 man for every 700 square feet of ground to defend. If you have ever stood in a large living room, you are standing in the space one Alamo defender was responsible for. Every wall, every angle, every shadow in the dark. On February 23rd, Santa Anna's vanguard appeared. He raised a blood-red flag from the tower of the San Fernando Church. The meaning was ancient and unmistakable. No quarter, no prisoners. Surrender or die to the last man. Travis answered with a cannon shot. The next day, he sat down and wrote the most famous letter in Texas history. He addressed it to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours, and have not lost a man. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then he added a line that sounds like a man writing not to a government but to history. I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible, and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. He closed with 2 words that would outlast everything else he ever did: victory or death. He was 26 years old. He had failed at law. He had failed at marriage. He had failed at nearly everything he had attempted before Texas. He did not fail at this. Among those inside the Alamo was a man whose story cuts deeper than any general's. Gregorio Esparza was a Tejano, born and raised in San Antonio de Bejar, a Mexican citizen by birth, Spanish-speaking, Catholic, part of a community that had lived on this ground for generations before any of the volunteers from Tennessee or Alabama ever arrived. Gregorio was in his early 30s, a farmer, a husband, a father. When Santa Anna's army appeared on the horizon, Gregorio made a choice that would define his family for generations. He gathered his wife Anna and their children, including a boy named Enrique, no older than 14, and brought them inside the Alamo, into the compound, into the siege. His wife begged him not to stay. Enrique would remember decades later. My father said he would not desert Travis. His wife asked him to leave. Gregorio told her, "I have come to fight for my country. I will not abandon my comrades." That is not a decision you make with your head. That is a decision you make with something older and deeper, something that lives in the chest. A man standing in a doorway with his wife pulling at his arm and his children watching, deciding that the word he had given to other men weighed more than the years he might have lived. And here is the detail that should haunt you. Francisco Esparza, Gregorio's own brother, was serving in the Mexican army, on the other side of those walls. In a few days, one brother would kill the men the other brother had sworn to defend. And then Francisco would walk across a field of corpses, to retrieve the body of the brother he could not save. Every Texian defender would be thrown onto pyres and burned after the battle. Every one except Gregorio Esparza, because his brother Francisco, the one in the Mexican uniform, received special permission to take his body and bury it properly. In a battle remembered for its total destruction, one act of brotherly love survived. One brother buried the other. The family that had been split by war was, in that small way, briefly reunited. On March 1st, a small miracle. 32 men from the town of Gonzales slipped through the Mexican lines in the middle of the night. Farmers, ranchers, volunteers. They were the only reinforcements that ever came. 32 men walking into a death trap on purpose. For 13 days, the Mexican artillery hammered the Alamo. The bombardment was psychologically devastating, but militarily it failed. The thick stone walls held. The garrison endured. But the men inside were wearing down in ways that cannot be measured by holes in a wall. Food ran lower every day. Sleep came in fragments between the crashes of cannonballs. Enrique sheltered with his mother and siblings in one of the rooms near the chapel. He could hear the guns. He could hear the sentries calling to each other. He could hear his father moving through the courtyard in the darkness, checking his cannon. On the other side of those walls, the men of Santa Anna's army were suffering too. Many were conscripts who had been marching for weeks. Their feet were blistered, their rations thin. A soldier from the Toluca battalion later wrote home, "We marched all night and at dawn attacked the fort. The enemy fired very well, and many of our comrades fell at the first discharge." That letter was written by a man whose name we will never know. He was probably in his late teens or early 20s. He had been conscripted from a small town near Mexico City and marched hundreds of miles to fight people he had never met. His story has no ending because no one ever wrote it down. Santa Anna's officers urged patience. Wait them out. The garrison's supplies were running low. His own secretary would later call the assault a useless sacrifice of men. Santa Anna listened and then gave the order for a frontal assault anyway. He chose violence over patience, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the Alamo to be a message written in blood. That night, 1,400 to 1,800 soldiers organized into 4 assault columns. General Cos, Santa Anna's brother-in-law, led the column aimed at the north wall. Cos had been defeated and humiliated by Texans in this very town months earlier, forced to surrender and swear never to return bearing arms. He was back now in the dark, leading men toward the same walls that had witnessed his disgrace. Whatever else this night was for Cos, it was revenge. The columns moved into position between midnight and 4 in the morning. Men lay on the cold ground in silence, muskets loaded, ladders on their shoulders. The bombardment had stopped, an eerie silence after 13 days of constant noise. Inside the compound, exhausted men slept. Crockett sat at the palisade with his Tennessee volunteers. The most famous man inside those walls waited in the dark like everyone else. There was no speech, no grand final moment. Just men sitting in the cold with loaded rifles, listening to a silence that felt wrong after 13 days of noise. Some of them must have known what the silence meant. When the guns stop, but the army stays, there is only one thing it can mean. Enrique lay in the chapel room with his family. His father was at his post. Neither side knew exactly when the killing would begin. The Mexican soldiers pressed against the earth could hear the breathing of the sentries above them. And somewhere in that gap, between hearing and knowing, the final assault of the Alamo began. It came just before 6. A bugle call cut through the pre-dawn air. Then another. Then the drums. Then the sound of 1,500 men rising to their feet and surging forward in the half-dark, shouting, "Viva Santa Anna! Viva la República!" Inside the Alamo, someone on the walls screamed the alarm. The defenders scrambled to their positions and the killing began. From the walls, the Texans opened with everything they had. Cannons loaded with grape and canister, Bags of metal fragments that turned each gun into a giant shotgun tore into the front ranks at 100 yards, then 50. The killing was mechanical. Rows of men simply disappeared. The column aimed at the north wall broke first. Men stumbled over the bodies of the men who had been marching in front of them. Ladders dropped. Officers fell. The column staggered, then pulled back. For a few minutes, the defenders might have believed it was working, that the walls would hold. It did not last. Mexican officers rallied their men and drove them forward again. This time, they did not stop. The Texian rifles could hit a target at 200 yards. The Mexican smoothbore muskets were accurate to maybe 75. That meant there was a killing ground between the walls and the Mexican lines where the defenders could fire and the attackers could not fire back. Every Mexican soldier who crossed that ground knew the only way to survive was to get to the wall and get over it. The math was simple and horrifying. Run faster than the man next to you or die in the same place he did. It happened on the north side. A low stretch of wall, weakened by previous demolitions, gave the infantry a foothold. A few soldiers made it to the base where the cannons could not depress low enough to reach them. They pressed against the stone, gasping, alive only because they were too close for the guns above to bear. Then they began to climb. Once the first soldiers gained the top of the north wall, the battle changed. They turned the defenders' own cannons around and fired them into the compound. More men poured over. The line on the north side collapsed. Defenders who had been firing outward were suddenly taking fire from behind. The Texans who survived the breach fell back into the long barracks. They barricaded doors and fired through windows and loopholes. Room-to-room fighting began. Mexican soldiers fired into doorways and kicked in doors and went in with bayonets. The compound that had been a fortress was now a trap. Each room a separate pocket of men fighting and dying in close quarters with no way out. This was not warfare. It was drowning in stone. The smoke inside the enclosed rooms turned the air gray and unbreathable. Some soldiers on both sides choked on the sulfur. Some of the defenders who died in those rooms may not have been killed by bullets at all. They were suffocated by the smoke of their own guns, dying blind in rooms too small to hold the war that had been crammed inside them. Travis was among the first to die. He was on the north wall, exactly where the breach opened, firing a shotgun into the mass of soldiers climbing toward him. A bullet struck him in the head. He fell from the platform into the compound below. The man who had written "victory or death" got both. In the long barracks, soldiers broke into Bowie's room and found a man too weak to stand, but not too weak to fight. Some accounts say he fired pistols from his bed, killing 2 soldiers before they reached him. Others say he was bayoneted where he lay. Either way, Bowie died in a room that smelled of sickness and powder smoke. On the south side, at the wooden palisade, Crockett and his Tennessee volunteers fired their long rifles into the soldiers advancing from the west and south. The accurate weapons dropping men at ranges the attackers could not match. But the rifles were slow to reload, and the men behind them were running out of time. The palisade was wood and dirt. It was not stone. When the Mexican columns reached it, they did not need ladders. They needed only weight and numbers. The logs buckled. The packed earth gave way, and the Tennessee volunteers who had been firing with such deadly accuracy were suddenly fighting at arm's length, with men pouring through gaps that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. Inside the chapel, Enrique heard the fighting reach the courtyard. Then he heard something worse. His mother pressed her body over his on the stone floor. Her hand covered his mouth. Through the gaps in the door, he could see the courtyard filling with smoke and shapes, and the flash of musket fire. Put yourself on that floor for one moment. You are a child. You do not fully understand what is happening. Your mother is holding you down. The noise outside is unlike anything you have heard in your life. And somewhere in that chaos, your father is fighting. You cannot see him. You cannot reach him. You know only the sound of the door shuddering as someone tries to break through. And then, through a gap in that door, you see him fall. Decades later, Enrique told the journalist, "The noise was terrific. We heard them breaking in the doors and shooting. I saw my father fall by the cannon in the chapel yard." One sentence. Gregorio Esparza, the man who had told his wife he would not desert Travis, died at his post beside the cannon he had been assigned to defend. One sentence was all Enrique ever said about it. One sentence was enough. The anonymous Mexican soldier who survived wrote home. The rebels defended themselves as devils would. They did not ask for quarter, and we gave none. 90 minutes. The courtyard was still. The smoke hung like fog. And then the officers found something that changed everything. A small group of men still alive, not wounded and helpless, standing, captured. The number varies. 5, 6, 7. They were brought before Santa Anna. They were disarmed. At least one officer in the escort considered them prisoners of war, men who had stopped fighting and were entitled to the protections of surrender. Santa Anna saw it differently. What happened next comes primarily through the account of José Enrique de la Peña, a Mexican lieutenant colonel who was present in the aftermath. De la Peña was 33 or 34 years old, a liberal officer who had privately questioned Santa Anna's brutality for months. He watched what happened, and he wrote it down. Not decades later, while the memory was still raw. According to de la Peña, when the prisoners were presented, at least one officer protested. A brave man, de la Peña calls him brave and prudent, stepped forward and said, "General, what are you doing? These men are prisoners." It was a plea. It was also, in that moment, an act of extraordinary courage. To challenge a general who had ordered no quarter was to risk your own life. De la Peña described what he saw. Some 7 prisoners were brought before Santa Anna. Among them was one of great stature, with a fine, open countenance, whose hair was inclined to red, and who was the naturalist David Crockett, well known in North America for his unusual adventures. Great stature, fine, open countenance, hair inclined to red. That does not sound like a man who had just spent 90 minutes in hand-to-hand combat. It sounds like a man who had been taken, a man who was still at that moment alive. Santa Anna answered with a gesture of indignation and ordered execute them. No trial, no interrogation, no hesitation. The prisoners were killed on the spot. De la Peña describes soldiers falling on them with swords and bayonets. It was not a firing squad, it was butchery. The manuscript was not published until the 1950s, more than a century after it was written, and when it surfaced, it detonated like a bomb in the world of Texas history. The idea that Crockett had not died swinging his rifle atop the walls, but had instead been captured and executed, was for many Americans unthinkable. Scholars have since examined the ink, paper, and handwriting and concluded the core manuscript is authentic. But the argument has never fully ended. And now the question, what did the boy see? The honest answer is, we do not know with certainty. Enrique Esparza's surviving testimony describes the carnage in devastating detail. He describes his father's death. He describes the bodies. He describes the terror of lying on the chapel floor while men were killed on the other side of the door. But no surviving account from Enrique explicitly states, "I saw Davy Crockett executed." Modern retellings have sometimes blended Enrique's first-hand testimony with de la Peña's officer-level account, combining a child's terror with an adult's political critique into a single narrative that neither man actually produced. The boy saw horror. The officer documented an execution. Together, their accounts form the closest thing we have to the truth. Separately, they each tell only part of it. For many Americans, the idea that Crockett did not die fighting was an attack on something they needed to believe. But needing something to be true has never made it true. And the man who wrote it down had no reason to lie. He was risking his career to put the truth on paper. When the counting was done, nearly every defender of the Alamo was dead. 189 men. The Mexican army had paid between 500 and 600 casualties to take 3 acres from fewer than 200. Every Texian death cost Santa Anna between 2 and 3 of his own soldiers. It was a victory. It was also a slaughter on both sides. Among the survivors were roughly 15 to 20 women and children. Susanna Dickinson, wife of an artillery officer who had died in the chapel, was brought before Santa Anna with her infant daughter. She was in her early 20s, a woman who had ridden into the Alamo with her husband and now rode out as a widow. Santa Anna told her he would spare their lives. He gave her a message to carry to Sam Houston. No quarter would be given. He sent her riding east, a living warning. Santa Anna ordered the bodies of the Texian defenders burned. Soldiers stacked the corpses with wood and brush and set them on fire. The pyres burned for hours. The smell of burning flesh hung over San Antonio for days. Every defender was burned. Every one except Gregorio Esparza. His brother Francisco, the one who had served in the Mexican army, went to his commanding officers and asked for permission to retrieve Gregorio's body. It was granted. Francisco carried his brother out of the Alamo and gave him a Christian burial. In a battle defined by total destruction, this was the only act of individual mercy. One brother buried the other. The family that had been split by war was in that small way briefly reunited. The story Susanna Dickinson carried east did exactly what Santa Anna intended, and exactly the opposite. It terrified the settlers, but it also enraged them. Within weeks, Remember the Alamo became the battle cry of Sam Houston's army. On April 21st, just 46 days after the fall, Houston's men attacked Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto. The battle lasted 18 minutes. The Texians killed more than 600 Mexican soldiers and captured Santa Anna himself. The Alamo had been a military disaster. Every man who fought there died. But the defeat accomplished something no victory could have. It gave the Texas Revolution a martyr story, so powerful that it burned hotter than the fires that consumed the defenders' bodies. And in burning, it created a myth that would outlast the truth. The mythologizing began almost immediately. Crockett, already a folk hero, became something larger. The version of his death that took hold was the one Texas needed. Rifle in hand, swinging Old Betsy into a wall of bayonets, going down in frontier glory. A century later, Disney's television series made Crockett a household name for a new generation. The coonskin cap became a national craze. John Wayne's films cemented the heroic last stand so deeply that when the De La Peña manuscript surfaced, the reaction was not scholarly curiosity, it was outrage. But here is a fact that should change how you picture this story. The famous stone facade of the Alamo, the curved roofline that every American recognizes, was not there in 1836. It was added in the 1850s when the Army renovated the building. The Alamo the defenders died in did not look like the Alamo you know. The myth rests on a building that did not exist. And there is another erasure that runs even deeper. The Tejano defenders, men like Gregorio Esparza, who chose to stand with Travis and die for Texas, were systematically written out of the story for over a century. The Alamo was recast as an Anglo-American narrative. The contributions of Tejano families who had lived on that land for generations were minimized and in many cases simply forgotten. Enrique Esparza lived into old age. He worked as a farmer and laborer in San Antonio. Journalists came to ask about the famous battle, and he told them what he remembered. The noise, the smoke, his father by the cannon, the bodies in the courtyard. He never became famous. His name does not appear on most Alamo monuments alongside Crockett, Travis, and Bowie. He was a witness, and witnesses, unlike heroes, do not sell coonskin caps. Go back to that dim room in 1877. An old man sits across from a journalist. He has not talked about this in decades. But today he speaks. He speaks about a morning when the world exploded around him, and he lay on a stone floor with his mother's hand over his mouth and watched his father die through a gap in a door. Two versions of how Davy Crockett died. One made America feel brave. The other made a Mexican officer feel sick. A boy on a stone floor heard both the glory and the butchery through the same door. He did not know which version was true. He knew only that his father was dead and that the morning sun was the cruelest light he had ever seen.